Hey, welcome to BMCC Online. I am Justin. I am your host. We're so glad that you could be here today. We're in our Rooted series. This week's topic is compassion. What is compassion, you may ask? Is compassion pity? Is pity and compassion the same thing? Where's empathy? Where does this all fall, and how can I be more compassionate to those around me? Well, let's sit back. Jim's going to be talking about compassion today, and we will catch up at the end. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon.
So we're in a series, Rooted, and we're moving through it. We're actually on the other end now. If you haven't been with us, it's okay. Because today's conversation is really important. Today, there's one word I really want us to think about for just a few minutes today. This word describes Jesus better to me than any other word I can think of. If you say this word, you're speaking the word that just embodies who Jesus is, was, and desires us to be. And the word is compassion. Compassion. Compassion is the critical indicator of our connection to God. If you are a compassionate person, there's something in you that looks like Jesus. And sometimes we're not always compassionate. But compassion, it's a response to the world around us. Compassion is the way that when we see something, we can respond with compassion, or sometimes we respond with apathy, right? Sometimes we respond with judgment. Sometimes we respond with anger. And sometimes we respond with compassion. It's so key. It is something in us that reflects the nature of who Jesus is and was. People lack compassion sometimes, and a lot of times we might lack compassion because of something that's happened to us or something that's happening in us. Something stole our ability to have compassion. Maybe I'm overwhelmed, right? Maybe there's so much going on around me that I'm unable to have compassion for the people and the situations around me. You've been walking along and in your own world before, right? And you didn't really notice what was happening around you. In fact, there have been times when you're walking along and there's somebody that you know pretty well standing right beside you and you didn't even pick up on it. In fact, yesterday I was out around town and I saw one of you. Someone in this room right now, I saw you and I said your name. You were within 3 feet of me. I said your name and you didn't look up. You were in your own world. Was it me? Yeah, everybody's like, I don't know, it's me. Maybe. It's funny that happens to us, though. We get so consumed with what's happening in our own hearts and minds, in our own heads. Here's what compassion can look like. So I was a youth pastor in Texas, and I've told that story so many times, but we had 3 pastors on staff. There was the senior pastor, there was myself, I was the youth pastor, and then we had a worship pastor. So there were 3 of us, and we would rotate basically who would go to the hospital. If somebody was sick, and in Houston, you know, if somebody's in the hospital, it can be any of the various hospitals. It was kind of a major ordeal in Houston because it's just such a complex area to get around and that kind of thing. But we would rotate, but the senior pastor, Ron, he was in the Army Reserves. And so one weekend per month, he was unavailable to do anything in terms of going to the hospital or anything. So typically, I would cover for him. Well, we had a woman in the church who was very sick with cancer. It was an aggressive cancer. She was at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. You may have heard of it. It's a huge cancer center. And so our prayer was that as she came close to the end, he wouldn't be on duty that weekend. Because honestly, I had no idea what to do. But the call came. He was away, the call came, and I jumped in my car and drove down to the MD Anderson Cancer Center. And as I'm driving there, I am so unsure of myself. What do I say? How do I help her, comfort her? What do I say to her family members? I mean, I knew her husband pretty well, and her son was one of my youth leaders. What do I say to comfort them? What do I pray? How can I even walk into this moment? I had no idea how to step into that moment. And I was filled with questions and fear and anxiety, and it was all swirling around in my head. And the other thing, there was something else that had happened just a few days earlier with her. Vanjie was her name. And should I tell you about that? Do you want to hear about that? It was weird. Are you interested in that story? All right, let me tell you that real quick. Don't count this time against me, okay? But I'd gone down to visit Vanjie just a few days earlier. And I walked into the room, and there was an elderly lady sitting with her. Vanjie was probably 50, and this elderly lady, I don't know, I mean, I was really young, so anybody over 50 was really old back then. But, yeah, right, I know. I'm feeling your pain, so don't throw anything. Anyway, there was this elderly lady sitting with her. And I walk in, and I'm trying to be, nonchalant, I'm like, hey, good to, introducing myself. And nobody really introduced me to her. And so eventually I said, are you Vanjie's mom? Wrong question. Because Vanjie, even though she was feeling horrible, she's near the end of her life, she laughed as she lay there sick with cancer. She laughed, and she said, this is my baby sister. Yeah. And it was one of those things, it's like, here's poor Vanjie, and she is dying of cancer. She looks horrible, but this younger sister looked older and worse, And so I learned a hard lesson in that moment that you never ask about a woman's age, ever. It's just not something you do. Neither do you ask when she's due. I mean, both those two questions will bite you. I'm not telling you that story because it still hurts. Yeah. But now, just a couple of days pass. Pastor Ron, he's gone, and he can't come. He's at the Army Reserve. And I walk into the room. Here's the illusion. You think pastors have it all together sometimes. You think, they know what they're doing. They walk into those moments, and they just have it. They've been trained, whatever. I was so filled with doubt and fear, inner struggle, so absorbed with that, because I'd never experienced anything like this in my entire life up until this point, and I was so unsure. What do I do? How do I pray? And I felt small, and I felt powerless, but I stepped into the moment anyway. So there's a secret right there. You might not feel equipped. You might not feel like you have an answer. You might not feel like you know what to say, like you know what to pray, like you know what to do on any level. But the secret is step into the moment anyway. Just step in. It's something that we have to do. If we're going to be people of compassion, you don't have to have the answer to step into the place, the moment. And there she was, Vanjie, and she'd gotten far sicker in the last day or two since I'd seen her. And yet, when I stepped in the room, I felt this is a holy moment. I knew it. I knew it was a holy moment. Because there she was, and her husband was there this day, and he had a washcloth, and he was kind of sponging her head and trying to help her stay cool in that moment. And I was moved as I stood there in the doorway. I wasn't moved with pity, Pity is something that comes on us, and it's an important thing that happens when we pity somebody sometimes. But pity, I didn't pity her husband. Actually, I kind of did pity him in a way. But it wasn't pity that I was feeling. Pity, oftentimes, we can stand back and pity people from afar, right? I pity him. Pity the fool. Who did I quote? Anybody? Mr. T. But you can stand back and pity. You can pity somebody you despise. You don't have to allow your heart to be moved to pity somebody. It wasn't pity. Neither was it sympathy. See, we can sympathize with somebody sometimes, and we stand there and we take in the moment that they're in, and we sympathize with them. I can allow intellectually process it and think, oh, wow, this is going to be a struggle. And I see what's happening, and I sympathize with where you are. But with sympathy, sometimes we can turn around and walk away, and it slides off our back as if we never really felt it. Sympathy isn't quite the same. It wasn't empathy either. Empathy is much more intimate than sympathy or pity. Empathy, you step into the moment and you feel the energy in the room. You feel the energy of the people, and you enter into that energy. You empathize with them. You might weep with them. You might be overcome with joy in a moment with somebody. If you're able to empathize, empathy is an incredible gift. Some of you are very empathetic, and that's a beautiful thing to be. It's a beautiful gift. But it wasn't empathy either. It was more of compassion. Compassion. Compassion feels deeply, in a sense, but doesn't get stuck in the emotion like empathy can. It doesn't always, but empathy can get stuck in the emotion. Compassion is moved to action. When you feel compassion, you feel it, but you're not stuck in it. Now you're going to move to action. So Luke chapter 7, verse 11. This is Jesus. Soon afterwards, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Let's just pause there. Leave that up on the screen. His heart overflowed with compassion. If Jesus' heart had overflowed with pity, he would have said, poor woman, poor woman. If Jesus' heart had overflowed with sympathy, he might have said, I see the predicament that she's in. I sympathize with her. A woman, and she's a widow, this was her only son. And now, how is she going to provide for her family? Her only hope was her son would grow up, and he would now be the man of the house, that he would take care of her in her old age or whatever. And so he could sympathize, but this is beyond sympathy. If his heart had been moved with empathy, his eyes might have filled with tears, and he could weep with her. I feel her pain. But instead, his heart overflowed with compassion. It's compassion. Don't cry, he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. Young man, he said, I tell you, get up. Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, a mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today. And news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. Where does compassion come from? I mean, Jesus is walking along, and he saw this woman in need, and his heart overflowed with compassion. Compassion came from seeing her suffering. It's not like we walk around filled with compassion. Where do I put my compassion? I'm just so full of compassion. I'm just ready to. We don't do that. But he walked along, and then he's overwhelmed with compassion. You see, if anybody in the world knew the curse of death, it's Jesus, right? Jesus was standing with God the Father when the curse of Adam came on humanity. When humanity was doomed to death, to mortality, Jesus was there. He knew what it meant. He knew what the curse of death meant. Jesus is the only one who stood on the other side of the curse. He knows what the grave is like, and he knows what life beyond the grave is like. But it was this suffering mother. He was just filled with compassion in that moment. Many times, compassion is the first inkling of love in motion. Compassion is the first inkling of love with feet, right? You might think, you either have compassion or you don't have compassion. You're just not a compassionate person, right? You either have it or you don't have it. Well, and that can be kind of true, but there's reasons we lack compassion if we lack compassion. There's a reason for it. What are some of those reasons? Sometimes our hearts can grow hard. Sometimes we can become apathetic. What are some of the things that dull our compassion? Well, one of the things that dulls our compassion is self-obsession. Self-obsession. All I can think about is me, right? All I can really see is me. And you can walk through life, and as you're walking through life and you're just kind of obsessed, you don't even see what's going to happen. You don't see the people around you. You're just thinking about you. In our culture, it's really easy to become self-obsessed because we're told it's all about you. It's about the customer. We can become so self-obsessed. And that was me walking into MD Anderson Cancer Center that day. I was so obsessed with what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? What am I going to say? What am I going to... I was focused on me. What else dulls compassion? Distraction, right? It's so easy in our culture to get distracted. Have you ever gone for a walk in Walla Walla and watched the cars drive by? How many cars do you think as they drive by the person's on their phone? A lot of cars. And it's funny because sometimes they're like kind of looking down and you kind of see them and they're like, yeah, you're on your phone. And sometimes they're just shameless and they're just like this. Or you're sitting at a stop sign and the car's not going. You know what they're doing. It's not like they're asleep. They're distracted. They're on their phone, right? It's just easy to get distracted. I get distracted on my phone too, not when I'm driving. Has any of you ever seen me distracted driving around? You don't even know what I drive, so. Actually, I just I apologize, I stuck out my tongue. One of the things that dulls our compassion is addiction. It's addiction. We can be addicted to something, and it has our attention, it has our focus, and so because I'm addicted to something, I can't see the other things around me, the people in need, the cries for help. I can't see it. We can be distracted by our own guilt that has gone amok. I feel so guilty. And I stand in this echo chamber of guilt. And because I'm in an echo chamber of guilt and I feel so bad about who I am in my life and what I've done, all this stuff, and it's bouncing around me, and I can't hear the cries of people around me because I only hear my own guilt. Unforgiveness, man. You talk about something that dulls our ability to have compassion for people around us. It's unforgiveness. And sometimes we think, yeah, but I just didn't forgive that person. But here's the deal. With the way the human heart works, our hearts get hard. When we're unwilling to forgive somebody, our hearts get harder. And so I'm unable to see with the same clarity, to feel with the same ability when my heart is becoming hard. Unforgiveness. Actually, there's such a great book. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I've recommended it over and over and over again. It's by Andy Stanley. It's called Enemies of the Heart. There are 9 copies in our bookstore. 9 copies, $10 each. Don't leave home without it. But if you're struggling with forgiveness and you need to let somebody go, the thing that will free your heart, get the book. Busyness, right? We're busy. I'm busy. You're busy? We're busy, right? And so I'm busy going from here to there, and as I'm getting there, it's hard for me to think I really need to stop in this moment. But here's the deal. Jesus is walking along, and he comes to the village of Nain. And he walks up to the gate, and he has with him a procession of people. A large crowd had followed him there because they're so interested in him. They need something so desperately from him that they've followed him right up to the village. And now here at the village, there are people coming out at the gate. And it's a procession. It's a funeral procession. And despite the fact that Jesus has got this whole crowd of people, and there's noise and there's confusion, and they're all wanting something from him, Jesus somehow was present enough to see this woman in pain. He was present. That is an incredible gift that we can give, is to actually be present in the moment. So he's present. His eyes are seeing this woman in pain. His heart is feeling. His ears are hearing. His spirit is connecting with the Spirit of God. And he's overcome in that moment with compassion to step into it. You know, some of the things that we call compassion in our culture today aren't really compassion at all. Sometimes you can be labeled, somebody will say, well, don't you have compassion on those people? And I actually thought of like half a dozen examples to share with you, but you'd think I was getting political. So I'm not going to go there. But some of the things that we call compassion, they're not real. They're not real compassion. Over and over, we see this pattern, though, with Jesus. He's completely present in the moment. He looks, and his heart is moved with compassion. And he calls this boy back to life. He says, I tell you, get up. I tell you, get up. And he did. And everybody was afraid. But there was another time that he's moved with compassion. It's Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send out more workers into his fields. So we see Jesus, and he's moving along. And he comes to this spot, and there's a woman at a well, and crowds are coming out. And he's moved with compassion. And he's speaking to his disciples, the 12, and he says to them, pray that God would send workers out there into the field. And at the same time, he's sending these 12 as workers into the field also. But he's moved with compassion. There's another time he's moved with compassion, and so he heals the sick. Then there's this other time that he's been teaching all day, and people had come from a long distance to listen to him. And as he's teaching, his teaching comes to an end. It's time to send the people home, and they're hungry, and he knows it. And so he's moved with compassion. He says, we need to get some food for these people. And so he multiplies bread and fish. Miracles, right? Jesus could do miracles, called somebody back to life. That's miraculous stuff, right? It's incredible. But this pattern, over and over and over, we see Jesus is moved with compassion. But here's the deal. I can't call the dead back to life. Can you? I can't heal the sick. Miraculously, not unless God gives me the ability in that moment when I pray for somebody, but in and of myself, I have no ability to touch somebody and say, be well. That power doesn't come from Jim. I can pray for somebody if God tells me to, but it's not the same as having it in myself. I can't multiply food, but I can feed hungry people. I can't heal the sick, but I can bind up wounds or go to medical school. Actually, they wouldn't let me in. But you can, right? And I can be a worker in the field that he describes. These sheep without a shepherd, and the harvest is great, but the workers are few, so pray to the Lord who's in charge of the harvest and ask him to send workers into the field. I can go into the field and be a worker in the field. So, okay, let's go back to the hospital room for a minute, if you will, okay? Back at the hospital room, I couldn't heal Vanjie. I walked into the room and realized this is a holy moment. I felt it. It's a holy moment. Her husband is there at the bedside, and he's wiping her brow, and it's a holy moment. And I didn't sense God saying, prayed that she would be healed. And I have sensed that before. Prayed that this person will be healed. I've sensed it before, but I didn't sense it in this moment. I didn't know what God's will was, and I was utterly, totally, completely helpless. But now, finally, I'm fully present. I stepped into the room, and finally, there's this holy moment, and I felt it, and all of my questions, all of my fears, all that stuff kind of started to melt away, and here I am in this moment in the room. And Vanjie whispered something. Her husband heard the whisper, and he turned to me, and he said, she's thirsty. She's thirsty. Well, guess what? Right beside me was water. There was a jar of water, and I poured her a cup of water. Okay, that doesn't seem like much, right? It doesn't seem like much. But in that moment, it didn't cost me anything, really, when I think about it. I didn't run down to the gifts store and buy her a bottle of water. It didn't cost me anything. It didn't take any real effort. I just used as much effort right there. Didn't take any effort. But in that moment, it was the one thing I could do. So moved with compassion, I poured a cup of water. So what, right? Well, probably nothing, right? But Matthew 10, verse 42 says, and if you give even a cup of cold water to one of the least of my followers, you will surely be rewarded. So wait a minute. A cup of water counts? Yeah, it does. It does. And then again in Mark chapter 9, verse 41, if anyone gives you even a cup of water because you belong to the Messiah, I tell you the truth, the person will surely be rewarded. It counts, a cup of water. Now, did I tell you that story so that I can be the hero of the story? Yes. No. No, I did not. No, for real, I didn't. And here's why. Because scriptures also say, if you brag about what you've done, you have already gained your reward. And so I just lost any reward I would have gotten by sharing that story with you. It's true. That reward's now spent. And that's okay, because what I want to share with you is when you're moved with compassion, it might feel like nothing. But to God, he counts it as something. He counts it even as something. You can step into the present moment. You can allow your heart to move past pity, past sympathy, past empathy to compassion. And when we allow our hearts to move to compassion, we're like Jesus. We become like Jesus. But how do we get past all these obstacles that are in our way? How do we be present? So I was asked to to speak at a Good Friday service years ago. This was back in Missouri. It was a community service, and it was a Good Friday service. Jesus said 7 things when he was on the cross. And on the cross, he said some really great things. And each pastor was supposed to talk about, one of these 7 things that he said, and you were given 3 to 5 minutes. Have you ever heard a pastor say anything in 3 to 5 minutes? They're not even warm yet, But they told me 3 to 5 minutes, and there's some great things. Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Oh, that's a good one. I hope I get that one. Or Jesus hanging on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That's a good one. He said, it is finished. All of these are so good. But you know what I got? As he hung there on the cross, the assignment they gave me, I thirst. What do you say? What do you say in 3 to 5 minutes? Jesus hanging on the cross, and he says, I thirst. And I'm wrestling with that. And then I remembered, I've heard those words before. I thirst. I'm thirsty. And I thought of Vanjie. And I thought, I couldn't give Jesus a cup of water as he hung on the cross and said, I thirst. I had no, he was 2,000 years ago, right? In a place I've never been. I had no power to do anything about that. But you know what I could do? For this dying woman who was thirsty? Matthew 25, verse 40. And the king will say, I tell you the truth. When you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it for me. When you serve one of the least of these, any act of compassion, any small act of service, you were doing it for Jesus. Maybe I couldn't give him a cup of water, but he counts a cup of water given to another person as if you did it for Jesus. So I walked into the room and I was filled with self-doubt. I was in over my head. I did not know what I was doing. I was ill-equipped. But as I stood there, I was moved with compassion. And my self-doubts melted and faded away. But you have to allow your heart to get there, or it will never get there. You have to allow. So God comes in. When we ask Jesus into our lives, we give our life to him and we ask him to come in and take over. And there's something changes inside of us. It's almost like we're magnetized now, right? You're magnetized. It's like a piece of metal that's been changed and now it's magnetized and it's drawn with compassion to people in need. We have to allow our hearts to be drawn with compassion. To be moved, we have to become available. We have to be open. We have to be present. To be moved with compassion, we have to allow our spirit to connect with what the Spirit of God is saying. Lord, allow our hearts to be changed. Allow the distractions to fade. Help us, Lord, to be in tune with your heart. Help us to push past the noise, the distraction, all of the stuff that gets in the way, and help us to hear the gentle whisper of your voice. May we become more and more a people of compassion, a people who look like your Son. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Jim about compassion. If you call BMCC Online your home church, we ask that you continue the act of worship through the giving of your tithes. You can do so by going to bluemountainchurch.com, and there is a give button, and you can give there. Let me leave you with this blessing. May you provide the cup that quenches and have compassion on those who have the least. And may you do this with the light of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and the only hope this world has ever known. Amen. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon.